Okay, so thank you, Randy, for inviting me to speak. I also wanted to thank Randy for laying a lot of the groundwork for the things that I'll be talking about today. If you didn't see Randy's talk last night, he's really done a lot of the foundational studies of elevating ornaments to a level of extreme interest in the archaeological field and in prehistory currently. So I'm going to talk about ivory generally, where it's coming from, what it is, why it's different, how we recognize it, some of its unique properties that might have made it appealing for specific uses, and when, where, and perhaps why we start using ivory, humans. And a little bit of overview of recent research, both questions and answers that I've been working on with Randy, with colleagues at Tübingen, with folks in Paris and Berlin, even Russia, looking at mammoth ivory over kind of the Eurasian scale. So to situate the use of ivory, I'm not going to go in a lot of depth here because we've had some lovely previous examples of the human timeline of history and art and symbolic behavior. But we have beads emerging between 100, definitely closer to 80 currently, 1,000 years ago, and probably bone tools being added in, as we saw in Ben's talk earlier in the African record, around 70,000. So the ability to use bone materials and the idea of making ornaments exists that early. Ivory ornaments and the intensive use of ivory generally coincides really with the cave art that we're seeing, with a lot of the things Randy talked about in the Aurignacian, Chauvet, figurines, early art. And this is the expansion of Homo sapiens into Eurasia. So around 43 to 33,000 years ago, with a pretty standard toolkit, at least in Western Europe, that's been largely defined based on the southwestern French sites, of blade-based technologies with this kind of steep, heavy retouch, very specific approach to making bladelets, as well as a really expanded and refined bone antler toolkit that includes ivory. And also the dramatic expansion of durable forms of representational art. So we've had a lot of talk over the last 2 days about what are symbols, what makes something a symbol, and really in the Aurignacian what we see, as Randy was saying, in comparison, like this difference in the quality of the kinds of art that's being made, is these are very recognizable. There's no debate about what they are representing, though their ideological meanings could have been very different. And many of these assemblages include a lot of beads that are shaped out of ivory. And at these sites that have ivory beads, ivory is very clearly the preferred material. So the basket-shaped beads here are made out of talc, but you can see here that quite a lot more of them are made of ivory. And also, at the sites I'm going to be discussing in France, 95% of the ivory at the sites is in some way tied into ornament production. And this is how it's done. So 3 of the sites I'll be talking about are where Randy's been leading excavations for a couple of decades, and they are all close together here in this Castelmerle Valley. And this is the production sequence for the beads. You take a long rod, you segment it, thin kind of make a little tab, perforate it, and round it off. And so this we know because all of these sequences have been found in relative abundance. So I do think, again, there is a difference in the kinds of investment that's being made during the Aurignacian period in these ornaments. There is a difference between low modification ornaments, so something that has just been perforated but not really reshaped, and then taking something like a mammoth tusk and transforming it into a bead. So to return to the raw material itself, in general, and especially for wildlife conservation purposes, ivories tends to refer to any dental material of commercial value. So canines of walrus, boar tusks, hippopotamus teeth, certain whale teeth, narwhal horns, but true ivory is really only the enlarged and ever-growing incisors of proboscideans and their extinct ancestors. So in the late Pleistocene in Europe, this would have been mammoths. And just a quick note on Mammoths and mastodons, they look very similar. They're not actually that closely related, as you can kind of see from their teeth. Mammoths are actually more closely related to the hyrax and the manatee than to the mastodon. They kind of diverge very early on. Mastodons are in North America only. We find mammoths on both in the Americas and in Eurasia. So I will be talking about mammoth ivory exclusively. So these tusks, and some of the reasons that we make this distinction between ivories and true ivory, is that they have a very unique structural organization. This is both to support their own weight. Mammoth tusks could be up to, I think, 9 meters long in some cases and weigh hundreds of kilograms. So just supporting their own weight requires a lot of structural integrity and a very unique design that material scientists have actually studied extensively for applications in making and giving similar properties to industrial materials. So this structure is composed of these radial microlaminae, and I'll return to those, that's seen in A, so they're extending from the center toward the surface. They contain the dentinal tubules that lay down the dental material, and then ivory, like most teeth, forms in concentric rings over the life history of the animal. These teeth, of course, don't stop growing, like most of ours. And then there is this Schrager pattern, which is a really unique feature that can be used to identify ivory compared to bone, antler, other teeth. It's only in proboscidean ivory, and it can even be used to distinguish between mammoth and elephant ivory based on the angle of these intersecting lines. And the basis for the Schrager pattern has been debated for quite some time, and recently really highlighted and explained by excellent work by Attila Friederike, who did really extensive microscopic imaging of ivory, including early proboscideans from the earliest tusks that we can find through modern living examples, modern elephants. So we've got these dentinal tubules extending from the inside of the tusk out toward the surface, and they're actually wavy. So most dentinal tubules extend straight from the center of the tooth to the enamel junction. And these curving dentinal tubules do some really interesting things to the appearance of ivory and to the structure. So ivory can break more naturally on this, what's labeled as a radial plane of weakness. That's between the sheets of dentinal tubules. And there's actually a phase shift in these undulations that causes these distinctive light and dark patches. So this is actually just a trick of the light playing off the angle of these tubules. And they also create these interesting breakage patterns. You'll see, if we see objects that have this kind of wavy, ridgy surface, we can recognize it as ivory and not bone or antler. And it affects the mechanics of ivory fracture in ways that help us identify human intervention in ivory processing. So for a long time, it had been proposed by Randy and others that Aurignacians were not extracting rods from ivory by grooving and extracting. We have no evidence for that kind of grooving until the Gravettian, really all across Western Europe. So we were looking at ivory napping and the byproducts of it and how to recognize it in the archaeological record. So this is just a study from the 1960s on the basic tensile strength of ivory. So this is elephant ivory. And they put it in two orientations so that it was pulling apart either at the growth rings, natural point of weakness, or if they oriented it so that the force had to cross those barriers, it really creates this very distinctive kind of sawtooth terracing pattern as the force propagates. So with Sibylle Wolf at University of Tübingen, she studies a lot of the material I'll be talking about from the French record. She studies the material in the Swabian Jura, southwestern Germany. I took the approach of just smashing ivory with a cobblestone on top of a limestone block. And this is 28,000-year-old mammoth ivory that was provided by Randy that was deaccessioned for research purposes from the AMNH. I broke this limestone block in half, and I chipped 3 cobblestones before I broke down the ivory very substantially. So when we're talking about the tenacity of ivory, this is old stuff, and it is still very, very sturdy. And what Sibylla did with flint knapping colleagues in Tübingen is she had experienced flint knappers nap the ivory. And they tried freezing it, they tried heating it. Neither seemed to have a very large impact, except that the heating was definitely not desirable. As you can imagine, if you heat up a bone material, it just becomes more crumbly and brittle. But these ivory flakes have morphologies that will look familiar to anyone who's examined flaked stone. They have often signs like a bulb of percussion, negatives of removal, these undulating ripples, and kind of a thinner terminal end. So we found archaeological examples at Aubry-Castanet and at Hohlefels, which both have extensive ivory working. They're both Aurignacian, and other sites as well. So some of these patterns, because tusks do break, could be naturally produced. So I think it's important to point out that these patterns alone aren't evidence for ivory working. It really has to be in a context where you have abundant ivory artifacts, then you can kind of comfortably say, but I think if you just found these isolated in a cave, you might need to go with a natural explanation. So another aspect of the ivory structure that really impacts its appeal as a raw material, you know, it's very shiny, it's very smooth. All of us are familiar with ivory, I think. It polishes much differently than bone or antler, and this has to do with the fineness of its structure. And this fineness is really partly due to the dentinal tubules. They are smaller and more densely packed in the mammoth tusk than even in the cheek teeth of the mammoth. And the crystal lattice, the mineral crystals, are actually a lot smaller than in the cheek teeth of the mammoth. So we've got smaller crystals, more dense packing to the dentinal tubules, and like any tooth, it lacks these Haversian systems for delivering blood and nutrients to bone. So those pores kind of cause a dulling on bone and antler, and they're really useful for identifying ivory objects, as I'll show you in a moment. So just to get a sense of this, this is some microscopic images of the long bone of a cow and of antler of an American elk. So, and this can also be useful for distinguishing between bone and antler in the archaeological record. The antler has slightly finer Haversian systems, and you can see that even though this ivory is much more enlarged than the bone and antler, you can barely make out all those little dentinal tubules. So we'll take a closer look at these images, but the takeaway is that there's no visible pores that really penetrate the material in ivory. If you're trying to distinguish between bone, antler, and ivory, and you start seeing these, and this is very light magnification. I took these images with a macro lens on a digital camera. So you don't really, even a hand lens would probably get you to this level. So these are ivory examples. And there are some dark spots. There's some pitting from chemical erosion, but you can see they really don't penetrate the material. They're not part of the structure. So again, and these are bead stages from the same ivory assemblages. There are a very small number of, I guess, fakes, if they were meant to be ivory. Or maybe this difference wasn't even noticed by the people making them, if they were using small fragments. And again, here's more ivory. And you can see these objects have also split along those structural lines that I was talking about. So here's another cross-section of an ivory tusk. You can see the Schrager pattern. You can see the radial microlaminae. They'll be extending this way in the image. That's starting to crack along those interfaces of the dentinal tubules. And you can make out the growth rings. So identifying ivory when it's been in the ground for a long time can be challenging. And all of these features might not be present, but these are the suite of characteristics that one has to keep in mind when trying to identify ivory. So that's what I have to say about the properties of ivory, and now we'll relate them to the use of ivory, which really, as I said, kicks off in the early Upper Paleolithic in France. And of course, there were elephants in Africa during the time of human evolution. Homo sapiens don't appear to have exploited ivory in Africa. No examples yet that predate this. And also Neanderthals were hanging out with mammoths and not really using their ivory. There's some incidental use, maybe some retouchers, maybe picking up a fragment and using it for something, but they're very few. Whereas Homo sapiens in Western Europe are making figurines, statuettes, so these date to the same time. The statuettes are all from southwestern Germany, as well as beads fabricated in France. In Germany, they're making beads as well. I'll show some pictures of those later. And points, hide scrapers, tools, though not in southwestern France. So these are the 4 of the sites I'll be talking about where these beads were recovered. And you can see they're recovered in very large numbers, hundreds of them. So this is another difference in the Aurignacian, that instead of finding a few dozen beads at a site, we're finding hundreds of beads, shell beads, tooth beads, ivory beads. And this exists in kind of this approach that Homo sapiens in Western Europe have to organizing their materials and, I think, themselves. So antler is being used to produce split-based bone points, very distinctive, very typical, kind of a type fossil for the early Aurignacian in Western Europe. And they're producing lots of them. I think Randy said yesterday at Abri Blanchard there are 200 of these points. So production is intensive, it's organized, it's regimented by material. They're making hide scrapers and hide working tools on ribs and long bones, and they're using ivory exclusively for pendants and beads. Now, looking at the morphology of these beads, digitally analyzing a suite of 26 different characteristics on 400 beads, there's a lot of statistical support for the idea that these were produced by a small number of people in a restricted area and that they circulated in networks of exchange. So thinking about the social conditions underlying production of symbolic material culture, this is the model I'm going with for ivory beads. And we can see when we coefficient of variation and the morphology as a measure of standardization, these beads really fall into the level that we would expect from modern day ethnographic examples of craft specialists. And then the distribution of production debris also supports an idea that there were centers that were really hot spots for producing these objects. So at Isteritz and Brassempuy, bead production stages make up a small proportion of the recovered bead-related items, whereas it's a fourth to a third at La Suquette and Castanet. And also we see a difference here at these heavy production centers. We have a lot of blanks where they've centered the perforation really down at the base, where you can get that nice round bulbous form they were looking for. These 2 examples from Isteritz looks like maybe it's someone who's seen this done but hasn't quite mastered the technique yet. So to talk about the context of ivory use, I think it's useful to look at what was going on outside of these beads and around them, and the motivations that may have underlain, or at least the conditions that were surrounding their manufacture. And I think I'll make a note, as we've seen from many of the talks today and some of the talks to come, cultural complexity is currently not really understood as something that we obtain at a certain moment and keep having. It's something that all human societies are complex to some degree, and we see greater and lesser expressions of that complexity over time and space, continuing today. So arguments for the early Aurignacian being more complex are these more complex technologies which involve larger inventories of items and greater complexity in the construction of these items. So whether it's moving from shaping a bone fragment to make an awl or a point, or breaking down an entire antler to make hundreds of points, or moving from perforating teeth and shells to fabricating hundreds of beads out of ivory and talc, we definitely see this in the early Aurignacian. As well as an intensified subsistence economy that involves the exploitation of a wide range of species and habitats, as well as greater concentration on a few staple species. So in this case, it's reindeer. As Randy said in his talk last night, reindeer was really the heavy focus for Homo sapiens in Western Europe. As well as the beginnings of occupational specialization at the individual, familial, and/or settlement level. I don't know that we can get close to individuals and families in the early Aurignacian, but we're definitely seeing site-specific production centers for beads and for points. Greater territoriality, evidenced by greater use of symbols and identity, symbols of identity. Larger amounts and wider networks of trade, which is related to the increasing specialization of production noted above. So here is a map of the circulation of lithic raw materials in southern France during the Aurignacian. They're moving long distances. These shell beads, so Castanet is in the middle of that circle, this northern Aquitaine. We've got shells from the Atlantic coast, shells from the Mediterranean coast. And I would argue that against these, ivory beads are moving. So people are investing in fabricating beads out of ivory when they are far from the coast. This is the case in central Germany, this is the case in central France, and I think there might be some merit to the idea that these were being produced both for adornment, but to circulate in these expanded networks of exchange, kind of inventing an object of value in the absence of a source for something you're used to using. So I mentioned the Swabian Jura, and in closing, I'll briefly touch on some of the differences in ivory use within the early Aurignacian, because they look really different. The beads look very different. It's a very similar approach to working these materials. The logic of production is similar, but in the Swabian Aurignacian, they're not restricted to beads. They're making points, they're making smoothers, they're making figurines, as well as a range of different beads. And I think this has to do with the abundance of ivory on the landscape. This is something I've also worked with extensively with Sibylla Wolff in her collections. In the Swabian Jura, they're exploiting living mammoth populations. There's abundant postcranial mammoth skeletal material in the Swabian sites, in the Aurignacian layers. This is not the case in southwestern France, where we have no evidence for mammoths that were coexisting in the area with these people. So the theory that Randy proposed many years ago and that we've been testing with chemical analysis now is that they were gathering chunks of ivory on the landscape. And as an example, this is work that Gary Haynes did, observing elephants in their natural habitat. When they come together at watering holes, there's a lot of pushing and shoving and fighting, and these chunks break off. And this pile on the towel he collected after about a 6-week wet season at a watering hole. So you can imagine that the Aurignacian landscape in France, even in the absence of mammoths, may have had chunks of ivory littering it, or there may have been locations where people knew to go get the ivory. And we see this reflected in the chemical signatures of the ivory. So another way ivory is unique is it contains a 10% replacement of magnesium for calcium in the dentin. So looking at the deterioration of magnesium and calcium from the ivory and the uptake of fluorine in the sediment environment, we've seen some interesting patterns between the Aurignacian at Hohlefels and Vogelherd in the Swabian Jura and Castanet. So fluorine content is not a dating technique in absolute terms. It's going to vary site to site, but it should be consistent within a site. So we see that at Vogelherd and Hohlefels, indicating that this ivory is all of a similar age in this sedimentary environment. At Castanet, it's widely dispersed, even more so than Isterites, and this is 3 different time periods we're doing at Isterites for comparison, 3 distinct phases of the Aurignacian. So this indicates that before the ivory came to the site, it was in a lot of different states of preservation. And in a paper that should be coming out in the next few weeks, we've also applied trace element analysis to these objects. And we can see that you can source ivory, at least at a regional scale, based on strontium, bromine, and zinc. And it looks like the Castanet material may be coming from farther afield than the material at a variety of other sites. So we don't have a ton of samples here yet. We're doing every 6 months, we're adding more. Sungir was the latest one that we've added to this corpus. And I think really what all of this adds up to, looking at differences within the Aurignacian, comparing the Aurignacian to other periods, indicates that we're really likely to find a lot of explanations for art, and not just one unified idea about why art. That really looking closely at specific contexts can show us the complexity and the diversity of motivations and situations that might make art useful to exchange. So thank you for your attention. I'll take questions. And references for much of the data and images that were provided today are here.
Good afternoon. We've had a slight change of title from what I think was in the original program, and are going to be talking slightly more broadly about expressive culture throughout Island Southeast Asia, which is the islands of the islands of Indonesia as well as Timor-Leste. So moving from Europe, you can see with the arrow here, where we're positioned just north of Australia, and we also will mention some of the Australian material as well. So this area of the world, as opposed to Europe, has been long characterised as a cultural backwater. I think it was Graham Clark who once referred to the lithic technology of Ireland, Southeast Asia and Australia as crude, colourless and not surprising in view of the rather unenterprising area of the world from which it arose. What I'd like to say is I think that our work has shown this to be incorrect, and the work of many people who are many young researchers working in Australia today is pushing those boundaries forward. So a cultural backwater, as Randy said last night, many of the places which were considered to be cultural backwaters probably were subject to really poor excavation. And in places like Europe, where the early excavations were probably no better, the quantity of material excavated was enormous, so much so that people left half of the engraved blocks in their back dirt to be discovered by Randy in future years. In Australia, we've had a much smaller quantity of excavation, obviously, a new country with not a very long history of academic pursuit. And so it was only, we've been pushing our prehistory back at a rapid rate over the last sort of 40 years. It's only in the 1960s that we really began to appreciate that we had a prehistory that was on a par with the prehistory of Europe in terms of antiquity, and now we have dates from Northern Australia going back to about 60,000 years. The area to the north of Australia is composed of the Indonesian islands and islands Southeast Asia, and there are 17,000 islands in this area, of which about 6 have had any archaeological exploration in any sort of detail. So the idea of a cultural backwater has largely stemmed, I think, from our very small sample sizes in terms of previous archaeological work in these, in either Australia or the islands to its north. Very, very poor recovery techniques or recovery methods that were used early on. In many of the early excavations in Ireland, Southeast Asia, sieves weren't even used during the excavations. In Australian sites, 6 mil and 3 mil nested sieves were routinely used until fairly recently, when 1 or 2 mil mesh sieve screens have become the standard. And also we've got the problem of tropical environments, both in Southeast Asia and Australia. For most of Northern Australia, extreme wetting and drying on a seasonal basis. So each monsoon, even if you're looking at rock shelters, the deposits are still getting wet and then drying out again in the dry season. So many of our Northern Australian sites and many sites in Ireland, Southeast Asia, haven't had good organic preservation. And this has led to this view of the archaeology of this region as being crude, colourless and rather unenterprising, consisting of lithics which show very little change. So with increasing high resolution work in this area, which has really started to take off with work like this, can be seen in this photo, which is the rock art in Sulawesi, which was reported by Max Obert and colleagues in 2014 in Nature, has shown that rock art in this region dates back to about 40,000 years. This is uranium thorium dating of what they call it, cave popcorn, over hand stencils and over large naturalistic animals, and has shown that the islands of Ireland, Southeast Asia, Sulawesi is one of the biggest islands of Indonesia, has a comparable antiquity, if not an older antiquity in terms of art production, as is found in Europe. And likewise, with the introduction of things like fine mesh sieving and wet sieving using 1 mil sieves, we're lo and behold finding the same type of complex behaviour like beads and bone technology as are found in Europe. So this just gives you an idea of what some of the large naturalistic animals look like with body infill. Now, the mobile art, which is common in Eurasia, we haven't yet got examples of on a par with Lion Man, but we are beginning to get some glimmers of these type of objects potentially in the Australian record. And I think future work will show there to be more of it. And Michelle's going to talk about some examples.
Okay, so as Sue was saying, while there's a lot of portable art in Europe and Western Asia, and this has been something that's been missing from Southeast Asia, Australia, and Pleistocene contexts. But as Sue was saying, we now have big, large-scale excavations underway on a number of islands using a lot of high-resolution techniques, and we're starting to find things. But also things are being found in museum collections collected a long time ago. Sorry. So in museum collections, things are also being found. One of the earliest being the Trinil engraved shells. So here you can see a shell that has a zigzag pattern that's been inscribed with a stone tool by Homo erectus some 500,000 years ago. Much later, but also engravings. These come from Adam Brum and his Australian-Indonesian team's excavation at a site called Leang Bulu Bedoe at Sulawesi. These ones are toolstone, a white toolstone, and in the cortex there are geometric engravings, crosses, cross-hatching, lines. He was excavating there again last year and has found additional examples of them engraving these kind of geometric patterns into the cortex of toolstones. And on mainland Southeast Asia, so in Vietnam, there's also a few examples. Like here you can see some stones that have like a herringbone pattern, they've described it. These are covered with ochre, and so they're suggested to be have some kind of association or use association with ochre, possibly symbolic, but also possibly medicinal, as in that region women are known to eat ochre during pregnancy, as it's believed to be a good thing for them to do for the health of themselves and their babies. But what we've really got a lot now is personal ornamentation. So thanks to Sue's work and others using small sieve sizes, we're getting a lot of marine shell beads. So here you can see a range of beads made on nautilus shells. So you can see a little nautilus here. These are large shells, so they come in large packages. These shellfish live at depth 300 to 500 meters, so we don't think people are actually going out and fishing for them, though you can trap them with cages that are lowered down into the ocean, put some meat in there, and they'll go in there and you can then pull it back up. So while Sue has demonstrated that there is deep sea fishing going on at the periods, we're talking about, we don't think that they're going out and catching nautilus deliberately for ornamentation purposes. These things wash up on the beach. So when one of these dies, the shell just washes up and you can collect it easily from the shore. So these are Sue's sites in East Timor. Jeremali has produced the earliest marine shell beads in the whole region. These have been on the nautilus shell, so the largest one here you can see is a large pendant. That one's about only 5,000 years old. We're getting smaller pieces of worked debitage. So we can see there these are fragments that have clearly been chipped and flaked and ground and drilled at 42. So we're not sure what the beads look like at those early periods yet, but hopefully we'll find some complete ones. So later on you get both disc beads and these two-holed beads that you can see here. The other types of beads that are in the earliest layers of Sue's sites are the ones C here, which are Oliver shells. She's got some almost 500 of these from these 4 sites. And I will run through how they were made and used. So I use what we call user analysis or traceology. So I have a look at each individual shell at different magnifications under my very fancy microscope, looking for traces of how they were first made, if they were either naturally perforated and just collected by humans and then used as beads, or if they were perforated by people deliberately to be used as beads. And in the case of these shells, we also undertook experiments to try and work out how the apex of the shell was removed. So as you can see here, the tops of the shells have all been removed, and through experiments we worked out that the easiest, most effective way to do this is to simply tap the shell repeatedly on a hard surface like a rock, and it just takes a couple of minutes, even only 30 seconds in some cases, to remove the top, and then you can pass a string through the beads. So they're quite easy to make. They come in beautiful colours ranging from beige through to bright white, so colours that are very attractive. And they're often worn for very long periods of time. So in E here, you can see that the body whorl has been worn away from rubbing against clothing or bags or the human body. So that kind of wear doesn't happen overnight. This is extensive wear of shell beads over a long period of time. The other thing that's happening is that they're making this type of beads from when they pretty much turn up in the area at Jura. We directly dated one to 37,000 years old. And then they were making and using them in exactly the same way throughout the whole sequence to the present day, pretty much. So that's almost 40,000 years of making the same types of beads, making them the same way and using them the same way. We could detect no differences or no changes in how they were being strung from the use wear. So that's fascinating that something like that can happen over such a long period of time. A new site that Sue's been excavating is called Macpan. It's just north of East Timor. And here they're getting a lot of these two-holed nautilus shell beads. So you can see some examples here. And the top one, you can see a bit of red ochre sitting in the perforations and between the perforations. There's also a lot of manufacturing debris, hundreds and hundreds of bits of manufacturing debris, as well as broken beads. These things are very small. They're like little sequins. And you can imagine with the nautilus shell, it's very nacreous and shiny and glittery. It's like having silver sequins almost that you could sew onto things. So looking at the use wear, it looks like they were sewn onto things. So they're shell appliques at 12,000. We don't know if it's clothing or if it's bags or an artwork maybe. But they've got something very shiny and beautiful that they're sewing or attaching onto something else, perhaps bark cloth. Probably not leather, we don't think, do we? So there's no real large animals to make decent bits of leather out of, so it's a plant-based thing. At 6,500 years ago, these shell beads turn up. So as soon as the environment around East Timor stabilizes, the shoreline stabilizes, you get these little Nassarius, which we saw in Ben's talk from Africa. As soon as these basket-type shell beads, the shellfish turn up, people start collecting them, they start using them for bead making. In this case, they're making shell appliques again, and that was demonstrated through comparing our archaeological examples, so you can see a few here on the left, with ethnographic recent collection of the same shells being attached to often belts or headbands. So in the photo here, you can see two young girls wearing belts that have got little shell appliques and a close-up of this type of shell. So it's interesting that, again, this technology appears at 6,500 years ago, and it was still being used and made into very recent times. A feature of the shell beads from Sue's excavations is that most of them have traces of red ochre or red colorants that have been rubbed up against them. The location and the densities of the ochre isn't suggestive of them being painted, so they're not painting the white shells red. They're painting themselves or their clothing red, and the ochre is rubbing off into the shell and working its way into the crevices of the shell where it gets caught up. And in the top right-hand corner here, you can see some of that ochre has actually got under the first layer of shell, and you can see that red sheen under the shell itself. So also at these sites, Sue's got ochre. You'd clearly utilised ochre. So you can see some examples here where you can see all the striations from people scraping it and grinding it to make powder. And obviously that powder has something to do with painting themselves or painting some fabric or some material cultural item from the bead evidence. In number 1's also very nice because it's, I'm not sure if you can see, I'll just see if I can get the mouse to work. No, yeah. So if you can see here, there's an impression of thumb, and on the other side there's a forefinger, so somebody was holding onto that piece of ochre while they were grinding it, and it's worked in a dimple into the surface, which is really nice. So these again go back to the layers dating about 40,000 years ago. Most of them are reds, though you also get mulberry colours, and there's a couple of really black pieces as well. So with all of that evidence, with the ochre and the shell beads, we're finding that in island Southeast Asia as elsewhere, people really like that white on red colour combination. They like the red body paintings or the red clothing or red something, and then they like the white shell, marine shells and white ivory that they're putting over the top, and it's a really startling, eye-catching combination. So that's something that's very interesting, and it's also interesting to note that red and white and black are also the colours chosen by Neanderthals as being attractive. From what I understand of Marco's work, is those feathers are black and white that they're choosing over colourful birds. Other things that are coming out of island Southeast Asia recently come from Adam Brum's excavations on Sulawesi, so just north of East Timor and the Indonesian island Susa working on. Here, he's found a site that's got a deep sequence. It's protected in a cave, and there's getting a lot of symbolic material culture out of it. So I'll run through some of that now. So we're getting beads and pendants. So here you can see a pendant made from a Couscous phalange, finger bone, where they've drilled a hole through the top of the flange, and then it was worn vertically so that it was rubbing against something. So there's polish on the back where it was constantly rubbing against a body or clothing or something else. The other thing we're finding is Barbarossa incisors, which they're using to make disc bead technologies. So they're getting the Barbarossa teeth, and they have this beautiful round natural white colour as well. And then they're not cutting, circumscribing it like you would elsewhere. They're kind of putting in a little dimple, and then they're just whacking it with something and it splits through. I've told Adam that he needs to go find some more that have been used, because all the ones he's found so far have just been made, not yet used, that we can identify. We've also found what we think is probably a blowpipe used for making the hand stencils that are in this site and in the surrounding region. So this is a Couscous long bone. And you can see on both inside and on the outside here, you've got red and black pigments. So Gillian Huntley analysed the colours on here and found that it is consistent with, it is hematite and it is manganese. It's not, it's not manganese staining over the top. So that's very exciting. But what do they all mean? So we have all this symbolic material culture now, but we don't know what they mean. So in Europe, we've been lucky in, from the Gravettian onwards, you've got the burials where you can start to understand where these things might have been worn, or how they were worn, or who might have been wearing them, at least in death, if not in life. And so you're able to start making some associations about how these things were used, and then can start to build things about community practices and beliefs. However, in island Southeast Asia, the only Pleistocene burial is this one found not too long ago by Sue at Trombone, also on Allure. Burial of a woman found with fish hooks. One which she wore, is it just one around the neck? 2, 3 around the neck. So we don't have the burials to give us any information about their context and life. So in Australia, we're just learning that ornaments we're able to see in ethnographic times can have very different uses over the continent. So nose bones in some areas of Australia are only worn by initiated men or leaders, male leaders. In other places, they're only for women, and in other places, they're for everybody. And once a child is a few years old, they'll get their nasal septum pierced and they get their nose bone. So another example of the kind of changes in over space of these types of material culture in our region are dentalium or scaphopod beads, which look like this, or another marine shell that's collected from the beach. And these are just some ethnographic examples, often paired with the pearl shell ornaments that you can see here have been rubbed with red ochre. So making these have been a little bit of a mystery. Some people have been lucky enough to watch the ladies making these, but from photographs it was difficult to tell exactly what they were doing. We could see they were using a knife, but we weren't sure if they were cutting or sawing or what they were doing. But eventually, through trial and error, we worked out that it's much easier if you just whack it with your knife and off it comes, perfect. So in Australia, these beads get collected off the Kimberley coast, and then they travel through trade networks. Now on the coast, where they're most abundant and where they're being made into things, they're for everybody. Everybody gets to wear these long, beautiful strands, and you can see a picture here of some young boys wearing very long strands of these dentalium shell beads. As they move inland, they become more valuable, they gather value as they become more rare. And here you can see a man wearing a very short necklace. They often become very restricted, only brought out at special occasions, special ceremonies, used by only particular people. So you can see that even just this one area of Australia, a marine shell bead changes significantly in its value and in its use. So what does it all mean? So what we know so far from island Southeast Asia is that there's that common preference for white on red that modern humans seem to like everywhere, that there's a common preference for shell bead forms. So they like the disc beads, the round shapes that are also quite popular elsewhere, and they like that have that continuity in ornament forms. But we don't know if there are changes, even if they're making them and using them the same way, if it's the same people using them, or if the actual uses themselves are changing between who can wear them or when they're worn or something like that. So there's still much more to learn in our region. So if you want to read more about this, I've just got a shameless book plug. We've got a book just coming out called Archaeology of Portable Art in Southeast Asia and Pacific and Australian Perspectives, and it really gives a summary of all the portable art in our region today. So that's a good place to start if you want to get your head around what's coming out of Australia, the Pacific, Southeast Asia. Thanks.
Let me start by positioning ourselves with where modern humans are once they reach the Western Pacific seaboard and the edge of Southeast Asia. So we refer to the combined Australia-New Guinea region with its continental shelf as Sahul. And Sahul's coastline changed dramatically over the millennia as sea levels went up and down. So when the ice ages took place, much of the water from the seas was captured in the northern and southern poles, which meant that the sea levels went down. And during periods of global warming, the sea levels came up. Seas were at their lowest, some 130 metres below present levels, between about 15 and 30,000 years ago, when large parts of the continental shelf were exposed as dry land. But at no stage was Sunda, the Southeast Asian parts of the Southeast Asian continent, connected to Sahul. So there was always at least 80 kilometres of sea crossing to be made from Southeast Asia to Australia. So let me see. I'm going to be navigating between a number of different Okay, so this is what the area looks like today. This area here is Sunda. You can see the continental shelf in the lighter blue and this is Sahul. But when people had reached the edge of Southeast Asia, let's say 65,000 years ago, this is not what the area looked like. So what we're going to do, we're going to literally navigate here through time to see how the land changed through the years. And we're going to go back to 65,000 years ago. And this is what the region looked like. So that what we now have is a sea crossing to be made that's at least 80 kilometres long. Now, sea crossing of that distance implies that people had to make boats. It's not good enough to just think, well, maybe you just have somebody hanging onto a log, because you need a viable population to arrive, and then over time to multiply in Australia. So we think that people arrived in Sahul, the exposed Australian New Guinea landmass, sometime between 59 and 71,000 years ago. That age range is the uncertainty period for the dates that have been obtained from a key site. But there's only one site currently known of that age. That's Majid Bebe at the very northern top of Australia. All the other confirmed early sites date to sometime between 46,000 and 53,000 years ago. And I refer to 1,000 years ago as opposed to carbon dates because these are calibrated ages which translate better to the calendar years that we know. Now, the earliest sites we know of are here. This area is called Arnhem Land and the Kimberley, with also some in northwestern Australia here. There is another very early site, Noalabilo 1, which dates to sometime between 53,000 and 60,000 years ago. So again, these ages represent the uncertainty of the scientific ages. All archaeological sites in Australia are thought to be from modern humans, fully modern humans, Homo sapiens, and there is no evidence of Homo erectus or Homo floresiensis, the latter being the skeletal remains that were found on the island of Flores a few years ago, which have been nicknamed the Hobbit. So there's no evidence of any of these pre-modern human species in Australia. So let's now ask, what is the earliest evidence for art in Australia? So we'll start with Majid Bebe, the earliest site. And something that Sue had said holds very true for this whole Australian region, and that is that most excavations are tiny. But Majid Bebe was different, was a large excavation. It dates to, we'll say, about 65,000 years ago, which is the midpoint between 59 and 71,000. And when the excavations were done, the excavations went down about 4.5 metres down. The radiocarbon dates went down to about 1.5 metres, but then the sequence of dates continued with OSL, optically stimulated luminescence ages. From the top to 1.5 metres, where the carbon date stopped, there was two sequences of dates, the OSL and the radiocarbon ones, and the two sequences matched very well. So that the OSL dates, which are dates based on single grains of sand, on the energy captured within them, kept going the sequence that had good integrity above it. So what do we find? We find at depth, at levels that are 65,000 years old, we already find ground edge axes. In Europe, we tend to find these starting in the Mesolithic and in particular during the Neolithic. And there's a number of these. Perhaps even more interestingly, for the concept of the origins of arts, we find evidence of ochre processing. So in this case, this is a grindstone with evidence of the grinding of pigment. You can see that at greater magnification. There is another one here. And we find evidence of the use of ochre crayons. Red ochre, which has been faceted through use, so grinding, and we find the striations on those as well, the fine marks created by rubbing. And in this case, yellow pigment with sheet mica around it. These are imported to the sites. They don't occur naturally at the site. Here is a floor level dated to sometime between 51,000 and 28,000 years ago, where we find at the same level a whole lot of other cultural materials. Edge ground axes, grinding stones, fireplaces, hearths, hematite, red ochre. So you can see from this photo even the opening larger areas of the excavations. We can start to look to find not only the items themselves, but the interrelationship of the different materials and how they lie on ancient floors. There's many other sites in Australia where, right from the start, we find evidence of the use of ochre. Nawalabula, between 48,000 and 58,800 years ago. This is again a period of uncertainty. Sandy Creek 1, 36,000 years ago, and there's other sites. Now, how can we get a better handle on the chronology of art? Now, this is a much more recent case, 3,000 years ago. Again, this is from Majid Bebe. The jawbone of a thylacine, an extinct animal. But here it only became extinct about 3,000 years ago. But this gives us a good clue as to another potential way of exploring the antiquity of art. Can we find evidence of extinct animals that have been painted or on which the bones we find paintings? I'm now going to move to a site to the northwest in the Kimberley, and this is one that Sue had excavated. And this site dates to 43 to 49,000 years ago. And here Sue excavated a slab covered with red pigment. This is a close-up of that slab. Notice also that at the site you have large numbers of engravings which haven't been dated, but many of these styles of engravings are thought to be extremely old in Australia. We've also got at another site a bit to the south, Mandu Creek, rock shelter, a series of conus shells that have been worked. Now, the arrangement is not the way they were found in the excavation. This is an arrangement by the excavator. But these have been worked and all hollow as beads. So again, this one dates to over about 35,000 years ago. Another way of finding out the age of artworks is through the skins, the rock skins that have built up over time on rock shelter walls. And in this case, this is work done in North Queensland to the northeast of Australia. We find a series of layers in a microscopic piece of rock that we find on top of the rock itself, of the bedrock itself. Under the microscope in cross-section, Alan Watchman identified a series of layers, in this case, yellow pigment, red pigment, another one of red pigment, and one of black. And he identified the black as charcoal. So using a laser, he was able to extract the charcoal, capture it in a vial, and do carbon dating on them. And all through these little black dots are all little pieces of charcoal from campfires or bushfires that have then stuck onto the wall. The interesting thing is, by dating different levels, all of the dates are in sequence. And in this case, these are radiocarbon dates. We've got this red layer, more than 28,000 BP. So that makes it a bit more than 32,000 years ago. Now what I'm going to show you is another example of a site that we thought was from that had a painting of an extinct animal. So what I'm going to run now through is a series of examples of sites where we're trying to get good, conclusive information about, well, how old really is the art? And in the process, we also make an unexpected discovery. This is in Jawoyn country, Aboriginal land in Arnhem Land. And this is the giant bird that was published when it was found as a Genyornis. Now, we thought Genyornis became extinct about 45,000 years ago. So if this really is a Genyornis, the painting has to be at least 45,000 years old. Notice that there's a spear going through it. So it's not just a bird, it's a hunted bird. So how can we find out how old it is? So I'll go back to the earlier photo. We took little pieces of rock, literally 1 millimetre, 2 millimetre long, in a part of the wall that was exfoliating, that was falling off. Put it into cross-section and tried to find examples of carbon to do carbon dating, but we didn't find any, so we couldn't date it. The second question we ask is, theoretically, is it even possible for a painting in an exposed environment like this to have survived 45,000 years, especially if the pigment is right at the surface? On top of the pigment, there is a very thin layer of silica that protects, that laminates the pigment. So in theory, it's possible that it has survived because this is extremely hard rock, it's a quartzite, and the pigment layer is protected by a sheet of glass, basically. So we decided to do an excavation there. We couldn't excavate immediately underneath because of these large boulders, so we excavated at the corner, underneath the corner here. Our aim was, instead of trying to understand the art by thinking of the art, instead we tried to understand it by thinking of the rock surface. Can we get an understanding of when that rock surface formed? Because these large blocks fell from that surface. If these large blocks fell more than 45,000 years ago, then yes, this could be Genyornis. But what happened if this fell more recently? So that's what our aim was, to try and understand something about the chronology of the art by understanding the antiquity of the rock falls that created the rock surfaces. So first I'll just show you another. So the way we did this was by doing a laser map of the site, a three-dimensional laser map of the site. What this would enable us to do is once the 3D map was made, we could, on the computer, pick up individual rocks that are both on the ground and those that are in the excavation, and then refit them back onto the rock walls. Because we had to make sure that the rocks that we're dating are the correct ones that overlay the surface that the paintings were then made. So the 3D laser model was then draped over with a good photographic coverage of the site itself. And you can see here, we haven't done the photography for the blocks on the ground. And you will see through this case study, but also through the next one that I'll show after, the utility of using 3D mapping for understanding not only the rock surfaces themselves, not only the rock art in the sites, but the structure of the rocks themselves and the antiquity of the structures. So what we were able to do in this case is, in the excavations, find evidence of the blocks, the base of some of those blocks. Date them by stratigraphic association, the charcoal that was captured in the excavation, and then work out a history of creation of the various rock surfaces themselves. And in a nutshell, this is what turned out. This is what the site looks like today. This is where the so-called Genyornis bird painting is. 13,000 years ago, this block fell. This is from a different angle. This is where the Genyornis site painting is, or the non-Genyornis now. So basically, the rock surface did not become available for painting until 13,000 years ago. It cannot be of a Genyornis. And I use that as an example to show a new method for dating art. So rather than approach the art directly through the art, let's explore the creation of the surface itself on which the art was put. Now I'm going to show you another example where this is what we tried to do with another site only a few kilometres away from the so-called Geniornis site, Nawala Gabanmang. Now this site is also in Jawoyn country on top of the Arnhem Land plateau. There are no scree deposits going into the site. It's hundreds of metres, 400, 500 metres up above the surrounding plains. And the site is extensively decorated. Now, notice that the ceiling is staggered. This is going to end up being important in understanding the history of the art and the history of the site. The other thing to notice is that the rock itself, again an extremely hard quartzite, is made up of a series of very distinct layers. So this work is done with Jean-Jacques Delannoy, a French geomorphologist, Jean-Michel Geneste, and Benjamin Sadier, and a team of other researchers. Margaret Catherine is the senior traditional owner from this area. She's from the Buimi clan. So all work that we did, we always had walkie-talkies. If anything, we were camping just outside the site, and if anything was found during the excavation, straight on the walkie-talkies, Margaret, want to come over, have a look? And Margaret would come up, would she say, no, keep going, I'll come over later on. Now, something about the Arnhem Land Plateau, the top of the Arnhem Land Plateau, it is littered with sites. Pretty much under every single one of these rock shelters, you will have rock art. Every single one of these rock shelters here has rock art in them. Same here. There are literally thousands of sites. Now, in Nawala Gabanmang, we found a single piece. The excavations we've done so far are very small excavations. We're now ready to start big horizontal excavations. One of the things we found, it's only 3 centimetres long, but a fragment of a painted rock. This one is somewhere between 27 and 28,000 years old, calibrated. There's also many pieces of use-worn pigment. They go back to about 20, 30,000 years ago, remembering that the older levels have not been reached in all squares, and this site occupation begins about 51,000 years ago in this site. This is the site, this is the entrance. Now, I'll be talking a bit about what we've just nicknamed the courtyard in the back. This is the northern entrance. This is the site from inside. It's extremely decorated. So again, we used the 3D model in order to investigate the antiquity of the site, both the art, but also the structure itself. Because one of the things, it's the Aboriginal community, it's the Jawoyn community who wrote to us to ask us to work in this site. And they've said to us, they rediscovered it a few years ago when they were doing a routine helicopter reconnaissance of the area, saw the shadow, and then wrote to us. They landed, had a look at the site, and then they wrote to us to investigate it. And one of the questions they had was, how did it form? How did the structure itself form? So the 3D model helped us understand this. First, we mapped the site in great detail so that every single rock bigger than 20 centimetres was mapped. But it's not just mapping. This was done by Jean-Jacques Delannoy, who used colour-coordinated symbols to look at every single rock, working with the archaeologists, looked at each one, and whatever had happened to the rock would have a different colour code to it. So that these dark brown ones are the only rocks in the entire map whose location that are now located in the place where they fell from the ceiling. All of these other ones were put there, do not belong to where they're found. These ones here are the pillars, are the vertical pillars. We also did the same thing for the ceiling, mapping the ceiling. This is the laser model, and again, you can see the staggered parts of the ceiling, so that the D series represents the code for the different layers of rock that we currently see. So D1 is a layer of rock above D0, etc. These different coloured areas are the art panels. Now, one of the questions is, how come we have these massive distances between pillars here, up to 8 metres apart, while here they're only about 1 metre apart? So to understand that, we've got to start by understanding the geology of the site. Essentially, the rock itself was formed 1,700 million years ago when the sand was laid down in a shallow marine environment. Through compression over hundreds of millions of years, it all became hard rock. But the weight of the overlying mantle, the weight of the rock at the top, was so heavy that tiny cracks developed in the rock. And again, through hundreds of millions of years, this all happened underground. Water entered these cracks and through time weathered away the sediments around them. But again, this is all happening underground. Eventually, the rock was uplifted and erosion took place. And at that stage, flowing water just washed away the eroded areas, the weathered areas. And through time, it became larger. Now, this all happened in geological time, a long time ago. This isn't happening anymore. So that the 3D map also enables us to understand this structure. This is the ceiling. If we have a look up, we tell this 3D laser model to cut the pillars just below their tops. This is what we find, the tops there. But then in some parts of the site, we find the very tops of the pillars without the base. This is the yellow ones. So if we put lines in the gaps between the pillars, we can now see the black ones where there used to be pillars. They are lined along two axes. And this is where, in geological time, there used to be pillars, but now there are no signs of them. So the question is, why is that? How did that happen? So on this side, you can see the remnant top of a pillar here. There's another remnant top here. When the pillars have fallen down, the ceiling itself then has no support. So a ceiling layer falls down, creating an extra space. But what we find in the site is very little evidence of these fallen ceiling levels or of the pillars. What we do find is ample evidence of smashed up rocks, broken by people. So for example, the scar here, we find the conjoined rock over here. We picked it up, put it back, it's an identical scar. It's an identical, a perfect fit. You can see they're flaking all through here. This rock is completely smashed all around. All of these rocks completely smashed. So that, looking again at the map, we can now try and understand where does each rock originate from. And not only that, what we find here at the front of the site and at the back are hundreds of rocks, all broken up to sections about this big, about 40 centimetres long, and thrown out of the rock shelter. And if we have a look in the southwest corner of the shelter itself, we find further proof that the site, the pillars, the missing pillars, are not just fallen down, but they've been systematically removed by people. Here, you can see a missing top of a pillar here. This one here, taken from a slightly different angle, you can see the sectioning. This is not a stress fracture. This is a flaking of the rock itself. And you can see one of the tools still in there. Not far away, this one here, close up, this is systematically flaked. These are all flake scars. And if you're going to push a pillar, you can't do it if it's on the ground and if there's a heavy weight on top. You've got to create a space and then you push them. And what we found is that those rocks that do remain at the site, as I said, systematically broken up, but the vast majority of them have been removed out of the site. Now this means that the site itself has been fashioned, culturally fashioned. It's a form of art. It's an architectural landscape. And we don't often think of caves or rock shelters as architectural sites. Again, this is just another view of the systematics of the site. For each one of these areas where we do find either rocks on the ground, large rocks on the ground, or missing pillars, this kind of cross-section has been done to investigate the relationship between the rocks on the ground and what's missing, but also to identify if the rocks on the ground are in their so-called natural order. Often you find them in reverse or you find them tilted. But again, they're always attempted to be broken up, and it's only the huge ones in the southwestern that remain. All of these here, that's another view of them, these are the hundreds of rocks that have been put there by people. They've been thrown out. Is it thrown out or is it really cached? They could have been potential grindstones. We don't know. Interestingly, the different sections of this area don't represent each of the layers, but in one area you might have only rocks from a single layer. In another area you'll have only rocks from another layer. So that these rocks themselves have been investigated to work out. So the large spacing between the pillars is anthropogenic. Again, this is an engineered architectural landscape. And further evidence, these once stood up. These all come from a single layer of the rock. Could not have fallen there naturally. Now, how old is this activity? We can excavate where the missing pillars are. Are they buried underground? Well, we know they're not buried underground because if they were, you would not have a flat surface at the site. The site is only this deep. The soft sediments are only that deep at the site because we're on top of the plateau where we don't get sediments coming in, except unless they're windblown or brought in by people. So we do find some evidence of collapsed pillars. And again, there's evidence of flaking along these and slabs from the collapsed ceiling. And again, these have been flaked to a standard size. Many of these have got paint on them, have got red ochre on them. There's a small patch on this one. Now, what is left for us to do there is to excavate some of these large... We've also done ground-penetrating radar over the entire site and magnetometry so that we can essentially we can view what's under the ground without excavating. And we've got out the maps showing where we've got sections of slabs which we'd like to excavate to see underneath, do we have very ancient paintings? That's the next step in the work that we haven't yet done. Here, the collapse began, the pushing aside, the working of the site as an architectural landscape began about 35,000 years ago, but it finished 11,000 years ago. And again, we can have a diagrammatic show of the process. So the key point in this presentation, is to think of sites themselves as constructed, as fashioned, as culturally fashioned landscapes, not just the paintings themselves, and to use the technology that we've got available to investigate that systematically. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I need to say this because I got a huge amount of inspiration during the last days. If we have a look on rock art, painted art, engraved art, what could have happened in music, because I have the task to create music for 40,000 years old instruments, and there's no evidence for no notes, no scores, and nothing else. And sometimes it's not easy to decide what to express on 30,000 years old instruments. Yeah, I'm a classical educated musician, and my special interest was for years, or I was involved in a lot of projects of contemporary music. And are there musicians in the audience? I hope so. Oh, only one, because my, my work is focused on the musical possibilities of these instruments. And maybe you know contemporary musical art. So there are a lot of things allowed. All is called art. And during my work, I got a little bit lost in between all these possible means and these huge amount of means in contemporary musical art. And yeah, that's why my interest in these ancient instruments started, because I wanted to reduce myself, the means I would use for music. And I thought maybe I could find something like the essence of music in these ancient instruments. But what I found was this tiny little swan bone, and after years I realized this offers another huge universe of musical possibilities. So let me introduce the time. So this is the time of the last ice age in the Alpine area. In the background, you can see the river Danube and the glaciated Alps. And in the foreground, here's the pointer. Oh, okay. In the foreground, you can see this valley. This is the Ach Valley, where we have two of the main sites, the Geisenkloster cave and the Hohlefels cave, where we found wind instrument fragments. And this is a tributary to the Danube, this river. Here we have a closer view to the sites. You can see here the Ach Valley again. And this is Geisenkloster cave, where these both instruments are found, the swanbone instrument and ivory instrument. And there we have Hohlefels cave, the best preserved cave of the region. There, the only instrument in situ has been found, the Hohlefels instrument made of Griffin vulture radius. And then we have Vogelherd. There a lot of small, different instrument fragments have been found with you can see the holes, the finger holes on it. Yeah, subject of my analysis has been these three main finds of the Swabian Jura. The Geisenkloster Flöte, they are all named after their finding places. Geisenkloster 1, made of swan bone, Geisenkloster 3, made of mammoth ivory, and Hohlefels 1, made of Griffin vulture radius, as well as the swan bone is a radius of a whooper swan. As you can see, none of these instruments is found in complete. So you can see there, this end, there are cutting marks. This is preserved. The other end is damaged. Here we have, beside the notch here, we have cutting marks. And this end, I don't know. Maybe Sibylle Wolf does know. And for Hohlefels, we maybe have preserved this end as a double-notched end, but a lot of archaeologists suppose that the second notch on the back of the bone has been broken out, and this could have been a blowing end, and the other end isn't preserved. So we have to produce reconstructions. Friedrich Seeberger, you can see here all the instruments I analyzed, and these are the archaeotechnicians who did the reconstructions. I can do this on my own with bone, but not with ivory. Yeah, this is really difficult to process ivory. And of course, Wolf Hein and Friedrich Seeberger worked as close as possible to the originals, but some of these reconstructions need to be the idea of the producer. So as there is the second end of Geisenklosterle 1, this end of Geisenklosterle 3 as well. We aren't really sure about this end. Here, has this been a double notch or not? And this end wasn't preserved. And and to get an instrument in comparison, I included into my analysis one instrument from Easteritz Cave in the French Pyrenees, 20,000 years younger, but an Aurignacian find, where this is the best preserved instrument from Easteritz. They have more than 23 finds, and this is the only one where both ends were preserved. So maybe we have a playing end. And we have to consider, okay, we don't know the total length of the bones. This is important for frequencies and fundamental tones. If we don't have the total length, we can't be sure about fundamentals. As well, we can't be sure about the original size of the finger holes, and I tested it out. Already, a difference of a millimeter could decide if it's about an half tone, so if it's a major or a minor interval, for those who are familiar with musical terms. So it is very important to remember that all data I got are from the reconstructions and not from the originals. So I'm dependent on the reconstructions. So, but even if there is a playing and preserved, we can't be sure how these instruments have been played on. On the conference of the International Study Group on Music Archaeology, we've collected more than 5 different possible playing techniques for these instruments. As there are the one Friedrich Seeberger suggested first, blown on the edge, like the Arabian flute, the ney. Maybe I just demonstrate it. So here we have the edge, and you put it in a transverse angle to your mouth. Or if there is a supposed notch like we have with the Geisenklosterle 3, you can play it like the South American quena on the notch, straight or vertically on the notch. There is material which wouldn't survive as reed or birch bark. So Jean-Loup Rangot, a French archaeotechnician, did experiments with adding reed, single reed on these instruments. This is possible or imaginable for all non-preserved ends. Of course, we don't know the end, as well as notched ends, because you need to add the reed, you need something like a transverse cut that it works. And I mean, the technique, the ney technique, is very difficult to learn. So this is, among flutists, this is the most difficult flute playing technique. But if you add reed, this is very easy to play. I will demonstrate it, but normally the instrument needs a warming up, so I hadn't time to warm it up, so please excuse strange notes at the beginning. Now it's warm. Yeah, works quite well. Sounds a bit different. It's called a proto-clarinet. I think it sounds more like a oboe. Yes, and Simon Wyatt succeeded with an interdental technique. This is also a ney playing technique which is used in Persian regions. You put the edge of the rim between your front teeth and blow on. I'm not able to do this. And Graham Lawson, a very famous music archaeologist, succeeded for Geissenklösterle III and the Isteritz instrument with a trumpet embouchure. For my presentation, I focused on playing technique 1, played on the edge, and playing technique 2, played on the notch. Yeah, now it's more interesting for musicians, the next part. So let me briefly explain the graphics. So we have these are the fingerings. I only analyzed simple fingerings, complex fingerings. I let out for this analysis because to make it more clear. Then we have here, you have the instrument and the playing method. And these normal notes are fundamentals. You just blow into the instrument and they come out. And these diamond-shaped notes are the overblown notes. You have to make the airflow a bit with more power and things like that. Then these are measurements, frequency measurements in hertz, of course. I just did it to complete the analysis. But the most important thing are these slashes or these diagonal lines, because they mark a special effect of the playing technique of method 1, because these instruments are able to produce, you can change the frequency without moving the fingers. So I will demonstrate. So I'm just altering the oral cavity and working with the embouchure. This provokes that we don't have single notes for each fingering. We have whole frequency ranges. And this makes it very difficult to define fundamental notes, because you always have a whole range, and this range could be, as you can see, for end 2, can be more than an octave here. So what was the fundamental of this fingering? But this is not, there's a limit for this effect. There's a gap to the overblown tone. And there's also a reason for the oral glissando, but I want to skip it due to time limits. If somebody is interested, I can explain it after. Okay, let's turn to the results of my analysis. Here we have Geissenklösterle 1 and 3. Both instruments are very well playable from both ends. Geissenklösterle 1 with no notch or no preserved notch on it is played with method 1 on the edge. And Geissenklösterle 3 I tested with both methods on the notch and on the edge. And you can see that the ranges are differing from depending on the end which was blown on. Here you have a larger range, and here you have a smaller range. For Geissenklösterle 3, blown on the notch, there is no oral glissando effect remarkable. So we have very concrete notes according to the fingerings. And it's again remarkable at end 2, played with method 1. I don't refer to proximal and distal ends because for my analysis it's more important which end was the blowing and then which end was closer to the body or not. And you can see this for young musicians. All these tones are sounding 1 octave higher, so these instruments are sounding really, really high, in a really high register comparable to the modern piccolo flute, or higher than this. So very high, sometimes penetrating tones. These are Hohlefeld's 1 with the most, with 5 preserved finger holes on it. I don't know if anybody knows the film of Werner Herzog he made. There is Wolfheim, the archaeotechnician, playing this instrument on the notch, but he later told me he was something like piping. So many colleagues, including me, tested playing on this notch, and it is too deep and too narrow to get sound of it, but you can analyze the pitched, something like the pitched air sound. So these notes here. From the other end, it is very well playable. You can see here again the Aurignacian effect. We have ranges, as well as Easterids. But for Easterids, you can see the ranges are much smaller than for the older instruments. So the Aurignacian effect is less pronounced for Easterids, and we get more concrete tones out of it. Both instruments, again, are playing in a very, very high register, or it's possible to play them up there. But if we want to understand what these instruments could tell us, so if you look on art, you can recognize, oh, this is a bison or this is a mammoth. If we look on instruments, we can reconstruct the chaîne opératoire or things like that. We can talk about the material, but this does not tell us something if we don't listen to it. So I analyzed different parts of components of music, and one important component is are scales or modi. But it's not easy to talk about scales if you have no fundamental notes, no single notes, only ranges. So I was thinking about how to define single notes, and I realized during playing and practicing, I do this since more than 7 years, I repeated certain notes frequently, and these were the notes at the end of these ranges just before the break to the overblown tone. I realized this, I noted these tones, and then I compared my results with the results of Friedrich Seeberger, who was the first who brought these instruments to life, and he also analyzed it. And we got the same results, except of the C sharp here at the end for Geissenklöster. He got a B flat. So I was wondering, and he published the B flat too, and we were working with the same reconstruction. So this was really comparable. But unfortunately, he passed away. He died just some weeks before my interest in these instruments arose, so I couldn't discuss it with him. But my idea is he didn't realize that he always repeated the same note, which was just part of the whole range. He just didn't realize that this is not the note provided by the finger combination. This is his own invention, this tone. So this difference in results reminded me to be very careful with defining fundamental tones, but on the other hand, it encouraged me to follow, because we had equal results too, it encouraged me to define fundamental notes with the last tone before the break to the overblown tone. If we define fundamentals that way, and this is another proof that, or evidence that I could be right with my idea, is if we define fundamentals that way, their overblown tones behave like natural harmonics in a line. So we have first here, this is the octave. Sometimes it's just nearly the octave. We are talking about approximate dates because there's a bending in the bone. This does not behave like a straight tube. But you can see the natural harmonics, and there we have the fifth. Yeah, so let's have a look on the musical intervals. For end, all instruments I tested from end 2, so the not supposed blowing end, provide the first intervals in the scales, as you can see here, are very large intervals. So very unusual for common scales all over the world. I don't know any scale which starts with a minor 6 or something like that. So could be a hint that this is not the right blowing end, because for end 1 I got smaller intervals like thirds and seconds, and we shouldn't stick too much if these are major or minor intervals, because, as I told you, just the difference of a millimeter of a finger hole could been disintegrated during the times, could change, could decide between minor or major. So, yeah, we got, so these are the results for end 1, except of Hohlefels 1. And this looks much more common to scales we know today. Yeah, and these, they are sometimes completed by fourths and fifths, as you can see. Where is it? Here are the fifths for Hohlefels 1. It is interesting to interpret these scales, but it is difficult for many, many reasons, and we should handle it with care. But I try to do a little comments on these scales. So Geissenklösterle 1, that one here, the audience is often asking for, could they play pentatonic? Pentatonic means you need 5 tones for different kinds of pentatonic. And if the instrument just provides 4 fundamental notes, this can't be a complete pentatonic scale, but it could be the intervals referring to pentatonic. It could be an incomplete pentatonic scale. Geissenklösterle 3 looks really strange. This is a tritone, a very strange instrument interval in music. Many musical traditions avoid this interval. So this scale looks a bit like there is a fault in reconstruction, but can we be sure what people 40,000 years liked to hear? I'm I'm not. Hohlefels 1, it's interesting, tested on the notch, provides a major triad, a clear major triad, and from the other hand, there we have at the beginning a minor triad completed by fifth. And Istorids offers the only 5-tone scale if we incount, this is unusual, but we incount, there we have a double F sharp. So normally for a traditional 5-tone scale, there is no doubling of tones. But I want to remind you again that because of the Oral-Glissando effect, all other, or a lot of other scales are playable than these analysis suggests. So we aren't only bound to pentatonic or diatonic scales. Yeah. What's following? Musical phrases. Yeah, of course, for all you musicians know that music is not only bound, or following intervals, each one after another. Music is, of course, has other components like rhythm and sound design. We don't know something about musical traditions at that time, but everybody who knows the making of flintos or other working processes knows that there have been rhythms in the working processes. Then sound design with these instruments, all these things we use today to design sound. So let the sound vibrate or not, clear or rough, flutter tonguing. All these things are possible with these instruments, as well as dynamics. It's possible to play very quiet. It's possible to play very loud. You don't need amplification like we have in caves often. You can play in the open landscape and you can hear each other in a very far distance. Articulation is an interesting point for wind instrument players because to articulate with the tongue, like do d d d d d, is difficult because this affects the frequencies very much. It's easier to work with impulses of the diaphragm. Polyphony is interesting. Was it possible that they played together? Did they knew how different notes played at one time, how this sounds? Yes, of course. There is you can sing and play at one time. This is a still living tradition in the Slovakian area. So you sing something like a bordoon and play on this. You can accompany yourself. It is possible to play together, and these instruments provide a very, very, very special skill. When I had these instruments the first time in my hand, I started and I got out something like that. And I thought, ooh, two notes at one time, there must be something wrong. And later I realized this could be a very nice, a real component for music. So these are multiphonics called in the contemporary music. And of course, everybody who knows, who has been in caves knows this noise, or this. Does this say something to you? There are always water drops in caves, so they could have imitated water drops or air sounds with just whistling. Or anything else like that is imaginable, as well as accompaniment by several percussive instruments. And after my concerts with these instruments, I'm working together with a percussionist, people or the audience often comes and wants to share their associations. I love this. This is really interesting, and they mostly ask, why did they do this, and for what did they do this? Did they just imitate animals, or did they express their feelings? Did they communicate through the landscape, or did they accompany rituals, or just played lullabies for their children? Yes, all this is possible, of course, it is. But these aren't single finds, so the Venus of Hohlefels has been found quite near to this instrument. So, and if we have a look on this figurine art, I can see there a transforming process in this art of abstract thoughts. So if we have something like fertility expressed in exaggerated sexual organs like we have with the Venus, or we have, I can see power and dignity given to a man by a lion head. This is a transforming process of an abstract idea, and couldn't that happen also in music? This is what I would add to why did they do these things. I was asked to record a CD last year, I think, for the European Music Archaeology Project, an exhibition which tours through Europe with, at the moment it is statuated at Brandenburg near Berlin. If somebody wants to come, it's until the end of May. I was asked to record a CD for them, so an archaeological project, not of course an artistic project too, but how to create music for these instruments. It was really difficult, and I decided together with, because it is not possible to reconstruct the fundamentals, and it is not possible to reconstruct Paleolithic music. So I decided together with my percussionist, we followed two ways. One is the way back, so we went to the cave sites and recorded there, and gathered experiences. How could it have been at that time? So we spent a lot of time in caves. We recorded in complete darkness. We used for accompaniment of these instruments, we used only material which could have been available at that time. And the third point was that anatomical modern human came probably through the valley of the ancient Danube, so to spread over Europe. So they passed, Yeah, of course. This is magnificent, like a cathedral. I never, or not more than a cathedral, I never heard acoustics like we have in Easteritz or even in Hohlefels. Yeah, and they came along the Danube, and of course, like these ancient stories, I'm not sure if a musical tradition could survive over such a long distance from 14,000 years to today, but I went there to get some impressions. What are the flute players doing in these regions like Slovakia, Hungary, Macedonia? What do they have for traditions like singing a bodun and accompany oneself by singing? Or this was one way, and the other way was the way into the present. As I'm a performer, I'm an artist, and I feel something like a responsibility to transport this immaterial informations from these instruments into the present. And of course, in our music or on the CD, we also provoke a clash of cultures. So we used also modern, very modern instruments, electrical sounds and things like this, just to see what happens. Concluding remarks I skip, but I want to let the instruments speak now, because this tells us much more than any words. Yeah, I introduced the instruments, and now I will give a little demonstration. last example with Geisenklösterle 1.